Today, I'm very excited because I have a special guest, a friend who is near and dear to my heart, Dennis Grieco. And Dennis and I have known each other now for about 15 years, I would say, maybe a little bit more than that. And he and I do training together. We've actually co-facilitated workshops at times. And along the way, as we got to know each other, I learned that he had a similar interest in all things spiritual. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And he's also, I'm very happy and honored to say he's one of the early readers of my book, and so I definitely want to have him share. He had a different way of going through it, and so we'll talk about that a little bit too. But Dennis, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Anytime I can spend with you, Rob, I'm very happy to do that.
Oh, you're a wonderful friend. I appreciate that. So the first thing I want to start out, and I'm not even sure I know the answer to the question actually on this one is, when did you first get interested in things spiritual and the idea that there's things out there that we don't necessarily know and can't see, but are, have some basis in reality?
You know, uh, there are different starting points for me. Um, I think from when I was very little, I always felt that there was like a presence around me, and that I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it meant, but I just felt like I got somebody or some people watching over me for some reason. I felt that at a very young age. Now, I did nothing with it at the time, but I think it was after where I had suffered several family losses that, you're working through the grief and trying to figure this out. And I was, 16 at the time, thinking about, all right, there's so much unanswered that you don't understand, that you don't know. And then I'm going to say 20 years ago was the first time I met with a psychic medium. Uh, I was at a barbecue at my brother's house, and one of the neighbors said she had just gone to visit this woman and how amazing it was. And she was talking about it. And from that point on, I'm like, okay, I need to pursue this. And so for the last 20 years, it's become is a topic of interest, something that I truly believe in, and something that I've explored in much greater detail.
Oh, that's great. Now, when you were little, because I've heard that a lot of kids, and I was not one of them, but people where they felt the connection or they felt someone watching over them. Did you ever get a sense of who that was?
All right. So, and this may sound crazy to some people, but I'm convinced the Virgin Mary came and visited me when I was little. I was sick one night and calling for my mom. And I just remember this vision coming in, leaning over me, looking at me. Um, and then my mother eventually came in, and then the vision disappeared.
Wow, that's amazing. See, I always knew I was in the presence of greatness, but I had no idea the depth.
Yeah,
No, seriously.
it was something I can still see her. Um, and that's who it felt like to me. I was maybe
Amazing.
5 or 6 at the time.
Any communication there?
No, she just leaned over me and was just looking at me. And I just felt this sense of comfort. I think I was probably a little intimidated too, but though there was just something very comforting and peaceful about it. And that has stayed with me my entire life.
That is amazing. What a gift. What a great thing to be able to have experienced. Wow. So fast forward then, to 20 years ago when tell me about your first experience when I take it you went to see that medium that your neighbor told you about?
Yes. Actually, my wife and I went together. She did readings in her home. And this is a very, you know, not a fancy home, nothing fancy. We sat at her little kitchen table. She was several years older. And we were with her, I'm telling you, for 3 hours. And like people who don't believe things, she mentioned things. And we went to her several times after that. She mentioned things that nobody else could have known. We were there for 3 hours. She charged us $35 each. She's not in it for the money. you know.
Yeah.
Uh, and it was eye-opening, and I had so many questions answered that I had been searching for decades, and got what I needed from her every time that we went to her.
Amazing. And you know, that's funny you said that because that was always a litmus test for me of the validity. It was how I felt afterwards. You know, did it bring me some sort of peace? Did it answer questions? You know, was there, you know, what was it as opposed to, you know, there were other times where I had sessions with people who were fairly well known where the biggest question in my mind afterwards was, why on earth did I do that? You know, because it was almost like at times there was an inverse relationship between the amount of money I spent and the value and the quality of the reading. You know, I've had some free ones, to your point, you know, where friends just did it and the things that came out were mind blowing.
Yes. And then I've been to other mediums that there wasn't anything earth-shattering there. It wasn't nearly as effective. But when I've gone to those who I truly believe have an amazing gift, I always felt so much better afterwards. And there's just a sense of peace that washes over you that you didn't have before.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you've, you know, checked in from time to time. What is the sign, you know, or signal to you that's like, oh, you know, it'd be a good time for a reading?
Oh, that's a good question. I think after a certain amount of period of time goes by, and I feel like, okay, I need to reconnect, or I need an update, or there are things going on in your life that you like, I'd like a little clarity around this. I think that's what drives me to want to do it. Once you've found somebody who's really good, you know, you get the feeling, I want to go every week. It
Yeah.
serves no purpose to do that, but it feels like, all right, because I have felt like it's almost a visitation with your loved ones.
Yeah, when it's a medium for sure. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. I could see that because I've only been to a handful of mediums and loved ones sometimes came through and sometimes they didn't. It was never, you know, there was never that wasn't ever like the driving force. It's like, oh, you know, I need to reconnect with somebody. It's just wonderful when they show up.
Yes. Well, and also one of the things that I've been told is that you get the messages you need to hear. So there may be some loved ones that you definitely want to hear from, but they don't have anything to work through with you, or they don't have a message. It doesn't mean they're not watching over you or they're not there, but it's the ones who have a message for you, the things that you need to hear at that point in time. So, at first I remember being very disappointed because I was really tight with my mom. And in that first reading, she didn't come through. And at the end, I asked, and then she stepped up. But I'm like, why isn't she coming through? And I was told, she doesn't have anything to work through with you. You had a phenomenal relationship. You know, all things were good. And so I'm like, okay, I've held on to that as well. And thinking, all right, yeah, I'd like to be visited by my wife every week now, because I miss her terribly. But unless there's a message, they don't always come through.
Yeah, I like that. That makes sense because, you know, I remember after my dad died, he showed up in a few dreams and things from time to time. And if I asked a question, you know, that he would step forward, but generally speaking, he didn't. And I had never really made that connection. But, you know, he was in the hospital for a few months before he died. And there were, even though I've got five brothers and sisters, there were three different occasions in the weeks before his passing where he and I were the only two in the room. And we had an opportunity to talk about a lot of different things. Like I had never shared with him that like there's hardly a workshop that goes by that I don't mention something that I learned from my dad. And I had a chance to acknowledge him in person for that because I'd never really thought to tell him that before. Or, you know, even just simple questions. Like I remember he was the one who got me interested in music. And I asked him, I had never thought to ask him, I said, you know, what was your first favorite song? And he told me it was the theme from Peter and the Wolf, which was pretty cool. You know, that and so there were all these little moments but to your point, there wasn't, you know, anything that we needed to talk about had already been discussed.
Hmm. Yeah. And if they have a message for you, you'll get it. And if they don't have a message at that point in time, it's like, don't be disappointed that you didn't get a visit.
Yeah, exactly. And now, okay, rewind 15 years or so. I don't even remember exactly how long it was, but I was dating a woman named Amber, and Amber is the angel that I mentioned in the book who helped me come to terms with my scarcity mentality. And one of the funny things that happened, and I didn't mention this in the book, she had brought me to a reader, and the person obviously channeled because my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, came through, and I was very excited because he and I were really close. He died when I was 14, and I just really looked up to him. He was a trader at the Chicago Board of Trade, and that got me interested in that, and he helped me buy my first stock when I was 10. He and I were really close, and at the time I was not only dealing with a scarcity mentality, but circling the drain financially from a lot of stupid decisions. And he came forward, and the message that I got was a very classic, something my grandfather would have said. He said, "You need a swift kick in the assets," which was really totally in line with his sense of humor. And and he was really concerned about what I was doing. And it was after that that I finally started balancing my checkbook and getting responsible and whatnot. And thank goodness for that. But he definitely had a message. He was not happy with the way I was handling things.
And you needed to hear that.
And I need, yeah, I need, and yeah, and I think he knew that I would be open to it in a way that I might not have been open to it from somebody else, because I so looked up to him, especially, financially, and what he had accomplished in his life. He ended up putting all his grandchildren through college, which is amazing, you know.
That's
So interesting. So, okay, so one of the things that has fascinated me more than anybody else I know, you were talking about signs. You've received a lot of signs, it seems. Talk about that, because that to me is just amazing.
as time goes on, I am seeing more and more of them because you don't always think on a daily basis, oh, that's a sign or that's this. You see something, but you don't always make the connection. So I think I've been much more attuned to paying attention. And actually, after my wife passed, my daughters, my son in law, my grandson, my son was away. We went to see a medium here on Long Island. And one of the messages she gave me was, your wife is saying you're missing the signs. She's giving you signs and you're missing them. You're not paying attention. You're not looking for them. And I'm like, okay, and that was a little bit of a wake up call for me because, sometimes I think I'm more astute than I actually am. But my wife knew me better than anybody else in this world. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, it's not always the obvious signs. And so one of the stories that I know I shared with you, Rob, was after that, about a week after that, maybe less, um, I'm out walking one of my dogs, and it is a clear day. It is a still day. It is a beautiful day. And it is not a day when there are leaves on the trees. And so I get to the corner with the dog, and now there are no trees on the corner here anywhere. And I'm standing there, and a single leaf drops in front of me. I mean, there's no way I could have missed this one. And now I'm like looking around, going, where did this come from? Where there was no breeze. Where could it have flown? It literally came from up above and landed in front of me. And all I remember thinking is, okay, I didn't miss it. I got the message. I got the sign. Um, and so that was one of them for me from my wife. The other is feathers. I get feathers, and sometimes big feathers where feathers shouldn't be. I walked into the house one day, and we have a rug right as you enter the foyer, and I looked down and there's a feather there. I don't have ducks. I don't have birds. My dogs, my dogs don't have feathers as far as I know, but there's a feather about this big laying on that carpet. And then one other time, I always plug in my phone on my wife's nightstand. All right, that she had her charger there, so I just used that. And I got up one day and I go to pick up the phone and there's a feather on it. And I'm like, where? I mean, I don't know where it could have come from. So for me, it's feathers. She leaves the rest of my family and she leaves a lot of dimes for people. I keep asking her for $100 bills. She's not leaving. All right, but she doesn't leave me money. But she leaves dimes for everybody else in the most bizarre places where dimes again should not be.
Which is really interesting now when you think about it, given that we're in a time that people aren't using paper money and coins as much as they used to, and yet dimes still tend to show up. I had heard one time, somebody told me that my grandmothers, that's their sign for me, is that they'll leave dimes in different places, dimes or pennies. Um, and which is interesting too, because I can't remember very many times that I've ever found a nickel.
No,
Uh,
or a quarter,
yeah,
or
or a quarter. Yeah, but
and
dimes are pretty common, and it's just it's interesting, how and then you have to pay attention and go, okay, what do I need to hear? What am I thinking or feeling or whatever right now? But just to know that like when you see it and you know that somebody's just reaching out, even if it's just to say hi,
yes,
that's pretty amazing.
yes. And then you'll be somewhere. I was just got back from vacation and we're sitting there and I was just talking about my wife because she wasn't with me, right?
Yeah.
The waitress comes over, she says, "Hi, I'm Patricia." And that was my wife's name. And I'm like, okay. Now all of a sudden I have these intense feelings of missing you. And the Patricia, the waitress, comes over. Okay, I don't believe I'm missing the signs anymore. I'm really seeing them. My kids are seeing them. Um, it's again, it's a sense of she's around, she's here with us, her presence is always felt, and those things show up at times I feel when we need them.
Did your kids recognize them as signs from the start?
I think as we were going through the grieving process, because this was a very unexpected passing, that all of a sudden they saw like the coincidences and not really coincidences of certain songs playing on the radio, or again finding certain things, or even just things in the house. All of a sudden, why would that be here? It, and then the messages we got from those mediums, which were so on point. I mean, one of them described my dining room to a T.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, I was like, all right. And I'd never met this woman before. She certainly had never been in my house. And for her to know what was in that dining room and describe the exact corners and where things were placed, I'm like, okay.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you do get a sense, from time to time that there are, that whether it's a medium who's going and is actually able to see your surroundings, or, I remember one time, my mom had gone out to my grandmother's house, and it was right after my grandfather died, and so, my grandmother was in a nursing home at the time, and she didn't want the china and jewelry and stuff to be sitting in an empty house. So after my grandfather died, she went out there to pick the stuff up. And it was amazing because, on the way home, she stopped at the nursing home and then she was going to go back downtown where we lived. And she went in. Now, at this point in time, my grandmother had full on dementia. She didn't know who my mother was 99.9% of the time. And when my mom walked in, she looked at her, and the very first thing she said, now keep in mind, the china and the jewelry is in the back of the station wagon, or sitting in the parking lot outside the nursing home. And my grandmother looks at my mother and says, have you seen my china? I've been looking for it all day, which is, China is not something people search for, and so clearly she was having some sort of an out of body experience because there's no way you can't convince me that was coincidence.
Yeah.
Well, it was the same thing happened. Like I actually shattered my nose playing hockey when I was in seventh grade, and a year later I got it fixed. And the next, in short-term memory is one of the things that disappears with people, and who have Alzheimer's, as she did. And literally the day after my nose surgery, my mom went in and she looked at her and she said, "How's Robert's nose?" Yeah, and, just weird things like so she was clearly even though she had dementia, she was clearly floating around and doing her thing, and picking up on stuff. So the fact that, a psychic could, and somebody who is conscious and not doesn't have dementia could tune into your living room is not a gigantic, or your dining room rather, is not the big. I mean, it's obviously shocking, but it's not unheard of necessarily.
Oh,
Yeah,
but
it's wild.
it's just one in a series of things that have been said to me over the years that I'm like, okay. And like even with the falling leaf, I ended
Yeah,
up going around the block and then another one fell in front of me. And I'm like, I got the message. You don't have to keep sending me leaves now. Um, but I don't personally believe in all of this is a coincidence. I think things happen for a reason. I believe in the afterlife and that I
yeah,
will be with my loved ones again. Um, and that we've shared other lives together in different ways. I firmly have that belief that
yeah, I
there's
agree with you. And I think in the case of something like that, I'd be curious to hear your take on it. My theory is that a lot of times stuff like that gets thrown out as a validation to say this may seem inconsequential, me describing your dining room as an example, but it's take it as evidence that the other things that I tell you are true.
yes, and I think those messages are validation. And look, they don't always get it right. They've thrown names at me, and I'm like, I have no clue who that is. Um, but when they hit on something that really works and is really true and that nobody else could have known, it's like, because look, I'm not sitting in their seat. I don't know how these messages are coming to them. They've explained that, and there seems to be some consistent patterns amongst mediums and how they get information, but they don't necessarily understand what it means. They need us to do that. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm giving away the store. They ask me something, does this ring a bell? I'll say yes. I want them to get more information. So it's not like I'm saying, oh yes, and I give them all the details. It's not how I've done it. And that's how I know the difference between the ones who are really strong at this and the ones who just feel like they're fishing for something.
Exactly. And that's why I remember there was one I don't know if she was a channeler. I don't know if you'd call her a medium, but I went out of my way to send her a cashier's check because she was in like Scottsdale, Arizona. And so that she didn't have my full name or home address or anything like that. Just as a way, not because, excuse me, not because I want to test people, but to your point, it's not gonna, oh, okay, they got one little fact right, so let me just tell you the whole story.
Right.
Yeah,
And for a lot of the mediums, especially the first one we went to, she had my first name. That was it. Nothing else. No last name, no email address, nothing.
yeah.
I,
Interesting.
and how do you get all this information? And my siblings have went to her. She's since retired, but I had so many friends and family members who went to her and they all walked out saying, okay. And I've had a couple of more since then that were just, I'm going to say, amazing.
What's the most surprising message you've received?
Surprising. I think it's when, like, a very unusual name gets thrown out and no one could have known this. Um, that always surprised me. Like, where in the universe did you pull out that name? Because we're not talking Mary or John here, right? We're talking a very unusual Italian name that I've only heard once in my life, right? And it was my godfather. And for her to pull that name out and then tell me at the time, he's ill. Um, your parents and the rest of the family, they're waiting for him. Maybe a while, but they're waiting for him. And for her to come up with that name, nobody could have known that. That was surprising.
That's amazing. Have you ever read any of Brian Weiss's books, like Many Lives, Many Masters?
I read that book, I can't even tell you how many years ago now. But yes, that one
Yeah,
I have.
I love that. And because I remember him saying something like that too, that, the validation of the validity of the messages that he was getting came in the form of names that no one could have known. Like I think there was in one case, there was like a Hebrew name that wasn't even on a birth certificate kind of thing,
Mhm.
and but it's interesting to me how like in Nadia, the you and I have talked about Nadia before, my personal favorite uh, psychic. I had a session with her not too long ago, and she was telling me about somebody that I was going to meet, and I said, this is a weird question because I've never asked you this before, but you have a sense of the person's name. And she looked at me and she said, I don't usually get names. But she said, let me ask, Fred. And she tuned in. She goes, I'm getting like a Susanna or Suzanne or something like that. She said, but it's not spelled the usual way. But she said, yeah, she goes, names are hard for me. Which is interesting because she's really good at a lot of different things. But there's some people that names like they're all about names. They get the
Absolutely.
names. Yeah.
I've had some who really didn't come up with any specific names at all. And I've had others that they named all of my children. And I'm like, it was amazing. Like the names came very clearly. And even referring to them either by their nicknames or by how I call them, so each one I have found, they have different skills, right? And they bring different things to the table. Some can describe how the person looks to a T. Others, don't really do that, but they'll come up with the names. So I have found I get something different from each of the mediums that I've been to.
Yeah, it really is amazing. I've never done it, but I'm intrigued by the ones who will they'll look they'll do a reading and pull up your soulmate, like if you're single, and then they'll draw a picture of that person.
Mm.
That would be pretty wild. I would be, very interested and curious about that. I haven't done that, but the stuff like that is fascinating to me, where people would take, that ability that you were talking about of visualizing something, and then if you've got the artistic ability, yeah, why not?
Mm-hmm. And so
Yeah.
I think you can't go to any medium and just expect them to be able to do all of this. You have to look at where their particular skill set is and get the most out of that.
Yeah. Now, okay, so one person, and I've seen her live, and I know you've had a reading with her, is Teresa Caputo, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, the Long Island medium. I remember being blown away by her, and it was funny. I remember watching her, and she was describing it. It was like you just wanted to shake some people because she's like giving them all of the clues, and and saying, well, this is what I'm getting, and I remember there was one person, she said something about, I'm getting like stomach or intestinal something, and the person's like, I have no idea. And she's going on, and she's like, oh yeah, well, my aunt has stomach cancer. And it's like, okay, yeah, but this is like 5 minutes later that comes out. And it's like you couldn't put that together from her talking about illness and GI tract and all that stuff. Uh, and you knew that she just wanted to like shake people, but she was amazing.
Mhm.
Uh, and I mean that in a charming way because she was very funny about it. But
She is
like,
funny. She,
yeah,
I've seen her live twice, but after Trisha passed, friends of ours. orchestrated through her people to get us a reading and be on one of her podcasts. So it was me and my oldest daughter, Alyssa. And so it was filmed very much like what we're doing here today. But, and then you're like, okay, I've always admired her. I've always thought she had a gift. She just came up with things that, again, hit the nail on the head. And you're like, okay, where did that come from? What was going on? One of the things she said to Alyssa and I, she goes, look, your wife's saying nobody in the family needs to get tattoos for her. And I'm like, well, that's good because nobody is. And my daughter taps me on the shoulder and goes, well, and I'm like, right. So I have 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. All of the girls were getting tattoos. Not my son, but I'm like, they said, yeah, Dad, we didn't tell you about that yet. But this is what came through. And they all got tattoos in different places with Trisha's handwriting, and all of that. And it's very lovely and very tasteful. But that's the kind of thing I was just like, yeah, no, no tattoos. Tap on the shoulder. I'm like, okay. Um, and then, we've been told you can also ask for some signs. So I'll use my daughter Alyssa again as an example. She said she's talking to her mom in heaven, right? And she's saying, Mom, I want a son, I want a ladybug, but I don't want just any ladybug. I want a yellow ladybug. Right? Because I don't know how often you've seen a yellow ladybug, but around here, they're pretty much red or a little bit orange. And so she and her husband and the baby at the time, they went down to visit my wife's sister. And she has a beautiful home on a lake. So they're sitting out at the lake. And at the table, all of a sudden, something lands on the table, a yellow ladybug.
Wow.
We have pictures to prove this. Okay. So that was the first yellow ladybug. That Father's Day, I was at my daughter's house and we're sitting out on the deck. And I'm sitting there. And my daughter goes, Dad, look on the railing. And I'm right against the railing. There's a yellow ladybug. And it didn't leave my side for like 20 minutes. It just sat there.
Amazing. Well, good thing she didn't ask for like a megalodon, but
Oh, yeah. Or a tarantula or anything like that. Yeah.
but
Um,
that is amazing because I literally have never seen a yellow ladybug, and I would never think to ask for it
oh,
either.
yeah. That
But
was her thought. She's very creative. And she said, okay, I'm going to ask for something. Let's see what happens. After Trisha passed, my one daughter and I were taking the dogs for grooming. And like the night before, again, it was only a matter of weeks. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I want a rainbow. And I want a sign. I want something with a sheep or a lamb on it. My wife loved sheep and lambs, and that was like our little thing. And so that was a Friday night. Saturday morning, I go to take the dogs to grooming. And on the way back, right in front of us, and again, I have pictures of this. It had rained a little bit, not like a giant storm. My daughter and I are driving back, and in front of us is the most gorgeous rainbow. Right in front of us, stayed on the highway until we got off it. So I'm like, okay, well, that's one. And my sister-in-law happened to be up that weekend. And she said, all right, I have a gift. She had made a quilt in honor of my wife. And she opens it up, and there's sheep and sheep. And I'm like, okay. I asked for those 2 things within less than 24 hours. I got both of them. Now, that doesn't always happen that way, but the intensity of that and then the timing of it, given we had just lost her, not a coincidence for me.
oh, definitely not. That's amazing. Did she know about the sheep connection? I mean, it doesn't take away from the story at all. I'm just curious if she does.
She did because when my oldest daughter was first born, she and my wife wallpapered the baby's room with pink sheep wallpaper. So she knew about it, but I didn't know that she was bringing the quilt then. And it's like, and there it is. So I just needed a sign. It had to come from somewhere. And that's where it came from.
Isn't that interesting? Because you just reminded me of something I had forgotten about, but I had done a class at one point. I don't even remember what the class was, but with a woman who was psychic, and she had offered to give me a free reading. So it was another one of those things. And she said, "Your maternal grandmother is coming through," and she said, uh, because I had asked if she had had a message for my mom, and she said, "Yeah." She said, I see her handing her the most beautiful salmon colored rose. She said, I've never seen a rose that color before, but she said it's really beautiful, and she's handing it to her. And I said, okay, great. So a little while later, I called my mom and I said, by the way, I said, Grandma came through in a reading. I said, do salmon colored roses mean anything to you? And she said, oh, those were her favorite. And she said that she and her sister had bought them for one of their aunts or something like that too, or something like. But there was an absolute. She didn't even hesitate. She's like, "Yeah, that was, absolutely a thing." And I would have had no idea because I had never seen that either.
Nope. And that's it. In some of the readings I've had, there were things that didn't mean anything to me, but I always took notes. And then I'd go talk to my brothers, let's say, and they'd be like, oh, yeah, that. And I'm like, okay, I had no idea about that, but it applied to someone else in the family, or they remembered something that I had no recollection of. And the validations that you get with that first reading, and I was looking for my mom, and she starts to come through with it, and I'm like, okay, she's just saying nice things because that's what it is. And I was, tell me something that my mom would know that nobody else really, or not, that you would never know. And she, my brother had a friend in the neighborhood, and there was a nickname for him, which I won't share. Um, and it just unusual, no, but nobody, no one would have known this except for us, at home. And I was like, oh, yes. And she wrote down this name. She said, does this name mean anything? And I'm like, okay, that's my mom. She's like, you used to call this guy this name. She says, you tortured him a little bit, but in a nice way. Um, and it was 100% true. And I'm like, that's a name you don't just pull out of a hat. So
That's
that's how I knew my mom was actually there.
Yeah. And I love, it's really interesting to me how the signs that you get have been, it seems like they've been consistent in terms of names and feathers and things that are repeating patterns like that. Because, for me, like the repeating patterns have always been numbers. Those are big ones. I don't know. I'm curious, do you ever have run into that where you see the same number over and over again?
All right, funny you mention that because in the last 3 months, every time, like if I'm looking at the clock or the TV or whatever, my birthday comes up.
Interesting.
And I'm like, why am I looking at the clock? Why am I waking up? Why am I seeing this number everywhere? My month and my date comes up so often. And but just like in the last 3 months or so, I don't know what the message is or who's actually sending it, but there's something going on that number flashes before me. I'm checking. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. And I'm not consciously looking for it.
Yeah. That would be an interesting question to ask next time you have a reading with somebody is, what's the message there? Because I get the month and the year I was born.
Uh,
That shows up a lot.
yep. I get the month and the day.
Yeah,
Don't know why, but
interesting.
and I've mentioned that to my family. Like every time I look at the clock or my watch, that number's there. It's very weird.
Yeah, that is weird. Yeah, have you looked up Joanna Sacred Scribes? She's big into numerology. If you do a search for angel, if you put in that number and then you say angel number and then just put Joanne, the angel number, what that number means will show up. It's pretty, because sometimes I'll see repeating numbers like, I might go for a day where I see like 1919 a bunch of different times, and
Right.
then I'll look it up. And it's interesting how often what it's saying about those numbers is relevant to what I might be thinking or feeling at that time. I do that a lot. It doesn't, like everything, it doesn't work 100% of the time, but
I'd
that's an
be,
interesting.
yeah, I'd be curious about that because it's been repetitive. It's been happening, you know. And then I think back to the signs, you have to be aware. After the last reading I had, which was about a year ago, um, so much came out and so many details that again, this guy couldn't have known. And I'm driving home and I said, okay, I could go on the highway, but I was in no shape. I was a mess. So I said, I'm just going to take, the back roads to go home. So there's a stop, there's a light, right? A traffic light, like every 20 feet. So there was a lot of stop and starting. And I was crying and just very emotional. And I got to one light, and for whatever reason, now this has been light after light, and I haven't looked at anything. I stop at this one light and I look up, and the license plate in front of me says, "My soulmate."
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So here I am taking a picture of that because I'm like, my kids are not going to believe this. And I'm like, okay, so she was with me in the car at that point in time. For whatever reason, I had not looked at any other license plate. I look up and that one was there. There's a
Amazing.
reason. There's a
And
reason.
she obviously knew that you needed a hug and a little affirmation in that moment.
Mhm.
Wow, what a gift. I love that. I mean, you and your wife must have had just an incredible connection for that to be largely uninterrupted.
We did. And again, a couple of the mediums said, oh, you two have been together in past lives. You have always had a tight relationship in each of whatever lives we had before. And it wasn't always as a couple. Um, but that's the stuff I'd be like, oh, tell me more. I'd like to hear more about that. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things that, and I believe, at least in this lifetime, we were put together for a number of different reasons.
Yeah, I believe that. I do think that we tend to travel with some of the same people. And
Mhm.
it's interesting how some of that shows up. I met a woman, I don't know if I ever told you this story. I was doing a workshop in Arizona and I had an extra day, I think just because of the travel schedules of trying to get back to Chicago. And the Titanic exhibit was there. And I've seen the Titanic. I've always been fascinated by the Titanic. I've read a zillion books on it. I've watched the movie I don't know how many times. And every time that I had a chance to go see the exhibit, I went to go see it. And when I saw it in Arizona, it was really interesting because they were doing it very differently than they had done it in previous times that I'd seen it. They had people dressed up in attire from the period.
Wow.
And a woman came up to me with this, 1920s evening gown sort of thing. And she came up and she said, "Sir, may I see your boarding card?" And I looked, and now there was one other couple in eyesight, and there was no one around beyond that. It was like the middle of the day, and there was nobody, there. And I had walked right past the place where I was supposed to pick it up, and I looked at her and I smiled and I said, um, I didn't know I was supposed to, get one. And she looked at me and she said, "Let me take care of it for you." So she goes and she gets me the boarding pass of somebody. And the boarding pass, I don't want to say who it is because for a number of reasons, but the boarding pass that she gives me is the exact same person that when I had a reading with Nadia, all I asked her is I said, "What's my connection to the Titanic?" And she started describing who I was, and it was the same person that this other woman had given me the boarding pass for.
Wow.
And
Wow.
that's come up a couple of times
Mhm.
where, I mean, you think about what are the chances of that? There were 2,000 people on that boat, right?
Exactly.
Um, and it was interesting because that woman and I are still friends. We ended up, connecting, and Nadia said, and I think somebody else told her the same thing, that she and I had had a connection, that we knew each other from that lifetime. And then I have another friend right now who also Nadia said was that we all knew each other from the Titanic, which is pretty wild.
Well, that's interesting because I wonder if my wife was with you because while she loved the beach more than anything, that was her peaceful place, but she absolutely vehemently refused to go on a cruise, did not want to get on a boat. And I always joked with her saying, okay, you must have been on the Titanic. Something happened to you in a past life that, you feel this strongly about never going on a cruise. So therefore, I've never been on a cruise, but I always joked with her, yeah, you might have been on the Titanic. So I don't know, Rob. We should double check on that to see.
That would be interesting. Well, because it was funny when I watched the movie, the person that I felt most connected to was also the same one.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. It was beyond like the coincidental sort of thing. It's just like what's going on there. Um, but I love that kind of stuff because whether in there's a I do think that there are times, that, people used to joke about how, like everybody who had a past life, would say that they had been like Jesus or somebody, and it's like, I don't think that's really true. I mean, when you read Brian Weiss's book, his patients were all slaves in Egypt, or, that was the lifetime that came up for his one patient.
Right.
And I remember the first past life regression I did.
Mhm.
Uh, I found myself at the day of my death in a countryside wearing a white robe, and the guy who regressed me, this psychologist, is like, he goes, "What you were describing, and given the year," he said that was I don't want to say insane asylum because we pieced together that I probably had tuberculosis or something like that in that lifetime. But he said you had been basically put out to pasture. And
Wow.
there's nothing aspirational about that. If I were going to
Oh,
choose a past life, it wouldn't be that.
no. But if you think about where our fears come from or things like that, because they're not always explained rationally, right?
Yeah.
So it could be prior life experiences there. I've never done a regression or anything like that. Don't know if I'd actually be a good candidate for that because I have trouble even just meditating because I'm like, no, I get to a certain point and I'm done. But I think there are things that we can't explain, and there are reasons for that.
Well, yeah, but it's interesting, and I agree with you because, like, the one time that I did the hypnosis, I was sort of surprised that I was able to be regressed. But some of the past life insights I've gotten have been from people who could tune into them, separately. Where they didn't need me to be hypnotized, thank goodness, because the likelihood of that happening with any regularity isn't that high. To your point, I think I'm the same way. But one of the things that came up, and this is wild. I don't know if you and I have talked about this one. There was my reading with the woman in Scottsdale, and her name was Stacy Gorman. She was amazing. I don't think she's doing readings anymore. I think she's retired, but she was incredible. And one of the questions that I had was, why do I have so many neck related fears? And she had said, write down the questions ahead of time, and then if there's time at the end, we'll get to them. But
Mhm.
I never had to ask her any questions because she talked for 45 minutes, so you knew that she was not, one of these people who was fishing for information. And she said in her very sing-songy voice, because her voice changed, and she's like, where does this speaking and writing ability come from? We will tell you now. And then she goes into this whole thing about these past lives I had in London as a poet and all kinds of other, writing lifetimes as a writer. But then she got into one lifetime where she said I had aggravated people. I was a Dutch freedom fighter, and I ended up getting beheaded, uh, which was interesting
There's your
because
next problem.
exactly, I know. As neck issues go, that's fairly serious. Um, What was interesting though, when I read Brian Weiss's books, he talked about that a lot of times people will have a scar at the site of a past life trauma or a fatal injury. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that would be really interesting. And then one day I was looking in the mirror, I was shaving, and I looked and I realized I have a line that goes like that in a like almost perfect semicircle. And at the time, I was going for physical therapy. And I asked the physical therapist, I showed it to her. I go, can you think of any reason I would have this? And she looked at me and she goes, it looks like a scar that's healed over. She goes, there is no anatomical reason you would have a half circle, at your neckline. To me, that was a validation that what she said is probably true.
Sure. And you don't think about those things. You just think, okay, that's who I am. But then all of a sudden, it's like, well, why is that there? It jumps out at us at certain points in time. And then that's the other thing I do like about some of the mediums is go in with, it's okay to ask questions.
Yeah.
Curious about something, they may not be able to answer all of them. All right. And I found the good ones will say, I'm not getting anything on that. They don't try to make up stuff. They don't, try to comfort you just for the sake of comforting you. Uh, but going in with questions, why not? What are you curious about? What do you want to know? I'm always thinking, well, what else could I ask next time? That
Yeah.
I didn't ask, or what's gone on in my life since the last reading, and what do I want to get out of this one? Because I think if we go in with that intent, we're more likely to get the information we need.
That's great advice. Yeah, I hope people are really listening to that because it does make sense. It's not about, can you tell me what the winning lottery numbers are? It's more about that'd be nice. And believe me, if
Wouldn't it?
that,
I would love that.
yeah, I'm not knocking that. If anybody has a line on that, I'm open. But you know, I don't think the spirit world cares too much about our financial, security necessarily. Uh, Question for you. I want to go back to the book for a second because one of the things that you said, which really touched me, was you said usually when you read a book, you basically devour it, and you said when you read A Trek Within, you didn't do that, and I'd love it for you to talk briefly about how you approached it because I've always known you to be a very thoughtful person anyway. So I'm, just for the benefit of people who haven't read it, and you can give the unsugar-coated, hated this chapter, you can skip it, whatever you want to say. Uh, but I'm curious because I was really intrigued by your approach with that and what you got out of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do love to read, but a lot of self-help books have never really done much for me. I don't know why. I have no explanation for, but I'm like, okay, there's a lot of sometimes extraneous stuff in there that I'm like, okay, I'm never going to do this, or, you know, that's not where I think I am or where I'm headed. And so I haven't really read a tremendous amount of those self-help books because they drive me nuts and I can't get through them. Get through a chapter and I'm like, okay, I'm done with this. With your book, what I found, and I do devour books. I start at the beginning, I read through it, and once I get into a book, I go until it's done. But what your book really did for me that so many other books didn't was it really made me want to reflect on things. I didn't want to devour your book in one sitting, and I could have done that. That would be typically what I would do. This, at the end of each chapter, you pose some questions or you just put some things out there to think about. And I really wanted to be thoughtful about this and step back and think through, what does this mean to me? What should I be thinking of here? What can I be more aware of that I'm not aware of? Or what should I be doing differently going forward with this? And so I would read a chapter, and then sometimes days or even a week or so would go by, and then I'd pick it up again, all right, because it's always on my nightstand, and then I'd go back and do the next one. I wanted to have an experience with this. Part of it was out of respect for you as my friend, but more importantly, because I was getting something out of it. And I think I've shared this with you, but every night, when I get into bed, the first thing I do is, okay, what are the 5 things I'm grateful for today? And they don't have to be gigantic things. It could be these tiny little things. And I've been sharing that with my children, and my one daughter in particular, who's got a lot of anxiety. And I'm like, okay, you're in bed. I go to kiss you goodnight. And she's 22 years old. What are the 5 things you're grateful for? Don't share them with me. I just want you to reflect on that and think about it. And I see how it's helped her appreciate some things that she wouldn't have thought of before, and to calm her down and to say, all right, there are easily 5 things I can say I'm grateful for today. And so that's how I approached your book, and that's how I feel I got the most out of it. And then ultimately, you know I don't know, 6 months or a year from now, I'm going to read it again and do it to see what I take away from that in a second read. I don't want to read it too soon because I'm still working through the other pieces. But I think you give a certain amount of time and you can go back and say, okay, it's like when somebody attends one of our training programs, if they've gone through it, sometimes people come back 2 or 3 times, and like every time I attend this, yeah, the topics are the same, but I walk out with something different. And that is really how I treated your book and the experience of reading it.
Wow, thank you. I love that you shared that because it's in that gratitude journal was something that was really powerful for me to get me out of my scarcity mentality. Because it's when you begin to be grateful for things that you literally, I do think that you vibrate at a different level and you begin to attract more of, if you're appreciating things, you're going to attract more of that. If you're finding fault with things, everything in life is going to seem horrible. It makes sense. I think we're like radio antennas in that regard. You know
Yes.
what? I did have two other, if you've got time, there were two other notes that I had, and I honestly don't remember what the specific stories were, but I had made notes last time we talked. You had a pretty cool story, I want to say, about your granddaughter and about a message you got about a new car, if I remember correctly. Do
Okay.
either of those ring a bell?
Yeah. Well, the my granddaughter's not born yet, but because I have a grandson, my daughter's expecting, and she's due in August. But when she first told me she was pregnant, this was right before Christmas. I just looked at her. I said, you're having a girl, right? And she's like, why do you say that? I said, do you remember when we went to this one particular medium? She was fabulous. She said, your mother's holding your daughter for you. She's holding your daughter for you. So I just knew in my gut and in my soul this was a girl. And she says, I don't remember her saying that. And ultimately my daughter went back and checked her notes. She's like, Dad, you were right, she said it. I said, oh, I didn't forget that. She said, she's holding your daughter, she's got a girl here waiting for you. Now this was easily a year and a half before she got pregnant. So I was
Amazing.
convinced and no, I would have been completely shocked if it wasn't a girl, because that's how strong my belief was.
Yeah.
Now,
And that makes sense. Yeah.
the other
I love
story
it.
was with my niece. My niece who's in California. She reached out because she had gone to a tarot card reader. All right. And they said to her, one of the things came up, they mentioned my wife's name, you know, and something about a blue car. So she reached out and said, yeah, I don't know if this means anything to you, but this is Aunt Trisha and something about a new blue car. And I'm going, okay. Literally, this was on a Monday. I had just bought a new blue car that Saturday. And she's in
Wow.
California. She's clear across the country. I haven't spoken to her live in probably since she moved. You text now and then, but that's pretty much it. And I'm like, okay. She goes, it means nothing to me. Does it mean anything to you? And I'm like, as a matter of fact, it does. I just bought a new car and it's blue.
Interesting. I love that. It's funny because sometimes, like now, that was the messages from mediums and stuff, but sometimes it's an impression that you can get too. I
Mhm.
remember somebody, I don't even remember who it was, but I remember somebody telling me that they had gotten in an accident, and they were really actually, it wasn't even an accident. I think their car was parked and somebody sideswiped it, and I had a very clear vision in my mind of a white car with red paint going across the side of it.
Mm.
And I asked her, I said, "Do you have a white car? And was the car that sideswiped you red by any chance?" And she was just like, "Huh? How did you know that?" And I'm like, "I can't explain it except for I just got a really clear picture in my mind of a door that was sideswiped, with those colors."
Part of that's, I think, intuition, and that's something I've gotten better at paying attention to as I've gotten older. Is like, if something feels off or something feels different, pay attention to it. Don't ignore it. Don't, shoo it away, and pretend you didn't feel that. It's like something's telling me something about this person or about this situation, or don't do this. When I get any kind of intuitive feelings around that, I am much more likely to pay attention to it these days.
I love it. Yeah, I love that you said that too, because I was going to ask you, for the benefit of people who are not as tuned in as you are, and I consider you to be really tuned in, what advice would you have for somebody who's, let's say, open-minded, but not quite there yet? They're still a bit of a skeptic.
And I know a lot of people who are still like that. And I'm like, look, it's okay to be skeptical. These are things that we don't know, that we don't really have 100% answers to. But in terms of being open to it, one, I always say follow your gut. If your gut is telling you something, pay attention. If there are red flags out there, listen to the look at the red flags, right? Because you're being giving them for a reason. And then, you know, be open to the signs, because I think if you're not going to see anything if you're not open to it. I think a lot of people are also scared that they're going to hear something. This is the date you're going to die. Well, if somebody's telling you that, run, because they're not qualified. That's a bunch of trash. Um, all the mediums I've worked with have always said, we're not going to tell you the bad news. We're not going to tell you any of that. We may throw up some warnings. They did that with my youngest when she was maybe 2. And they're like, all right, pay attention. If she's got a lot of stuffed animals on her bed, take it off. You know, does she have asthma? We're like, no, she may have allergies. Just watch it. And I'm telling you, 9 months later, she was diagnosed with asthma. So they'll give you those kinds of things to look out for, but they're not going to say, oh, you did this when you were 17. Holy cow. They don't do that. It, they're here to send you the messages you need to hear. They're not here to punish you. They're not here to tell you all the bad things or remind you of the horrible things you've done in your life, because you are a human being. It's not about that. And it really is about, I think, at a deeper level, understanding some things, some messages that need to be shared with you that that person did not get a chance to say to you when they were on this earth.
Yeah. That's so perfect. That's such wonderful advice. And it's funny, I'm smiling to myself while you're talking, because I'm thinking, when we lead sales workshops, one of the things, and I'm sure you talk about it too, is the fact that, what we're really selling is peace of mind.
Mhm.
That's the ultimate benefit. If there's a comma in the invoice, peace of mind is what they should be selling. And it's the exact same thing that we're getting. If you're open-minded, that's what you'll get from somebody else. And to your point, is it's nothing to be afraid of, because no one's going to look at you and say, I know what you did last weekend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. And if you have unanswered questions or unanswered feelings, all right, because the other thing that I've learned is once we cross over, right? And I believe we do. I mean, some people go in the other direction, but they've got much more to atone for. But I believe, when you get to heaven, and I've been told this by several mediums, you go through, and I don't know what the right terminology is, but you watch your life played over again, and you see, the things you did, the good, the bad, and everything in between. You relive that so that you learn your lessons, anything that you missed here on earth. But then you go through it a second time, but the second time you go through it, it's you are feeling what the other person is feeling. So when you did something great, you're going to feel how good it was. When you were mean to somebody, you're going to feel what they felt in that moment, because that's how we learn. That's how we evolve, right? And that's how we become better people. And so at the next go round, the goal is to take those life lessons with you and learn more of them, right? And
Yeah.
so I always found that really very insightful. And there are times where I'm like, I shouldn't do that because I'm going to revisit that in my life review, and I'm not going to be happy about that. So let me make a better choice, you know?
I hate it when I have days like that because I've heard of those life reviews, and I do believe it makes sense. It's because what I got out of that is that it's not you're not being judged by anybody, you're judging yourself. And you're judging yourself because you do see things from the point of view of the people whose lives you impacted. And that's scary enough. I mean, like right there, because I think about that because it's your point. I mean, how many times do well, I don't know about you, but I'll come home a lot of days and be like, okay, well, that was a miserable failure. Just like, I was sent here to learn patience, and clearly I'm not doing a good job today, you know.
But also it gives them an opportunity to share with you their regrets or their apologies for how they handled things or how they treated you. That again, most people are not going to, mediums are not going to know that. They're not going to find that out on Facebook, on Instagram, or anything like that. They're not going to know the relationship you had with that person. So when that person comes through and they've been through the review and they're apologizing for it and they're owning it, then it's like, okay, this is exactly what I needed to hear because I didn't get it when you were alive.
Wow, I didn't even think about that.
Mm-hmm. And I've
Yeah,
had that happen, and I've had people that I know, when no people mentioned here, but were not really good people when they were on this earth. And when they've come through, and one of the mediums told me, look, some people take decades to figure it out. They just can't accept it. So they're going to be in limbo for a while. But once they see it and they get it, they they want to make amends. They want you to hear their sorrow from their behaviors and from their actions.
interesting. Yeah, that'll be. I'll have to pay attention. No one's ever come through, from that sort of point of view from an apology, but I'd be willing to bet you there's dozens, maybe hundreds of souls who are waiting for me to pass on so that they can get their apology.
Well, just keep a list, Rob, so you'll know to pay it off when you get there. Um,
Excellent. Wow. Dennis, I can't thank you enough for taking time today. It's always a treat to talk to you, but it's great when now what I'm most excited about is that other people who I know, that are gonna get this glimpse of how I know you and just what an amazing person you are. So for you to take time and share such personal stories about your wife and your family, it means a lot, and I know it's going to help a lot of people. So thank you very much.
well, it's been my pleasure, and I certainly hope it helps somebody out there. Um, I all lessons learned, right? That's why we're here. We're works in progress, and so as always, I would do anything for you, Rob. You mean a lot to me, and I appreciate all these many conversations we've had over the years.
Yeah,
So
and well, and as my friend Jackie would always say, "To be continued." She never said goodbye. She's always say "to be continued," which I love. Yeah, so and we should do that. And I would love to stay in touch. Obviously, if you do work through the book again and other things show up, it would be fun to have you back on and have another conversation because I'm sure there's a lot of people who probably love your energy as much as I do, and just you just have so much wisdom. So. I again can't thank you enough for that. And for those of you who are tuning in, you've been watching the A Trek Within podcast. Uh, if you are interested in signs and synchronicities in the spiritual world and things that you can't explain, but would love to know a little bit more about, you're in the right place. I'll be interviewing a lot of different people, people like Dennis who have just a really interesting, background and interest in the subject matter. We'll be interviewing additional, psychics, intuitives, hypnotists, hypnotherapists, all kinds of different types of people you can expect to see in future interviews. So hit that like and subscribe. It's free to subscribe. Yeah, you get the notifications for when the new episodes show up. And in the meantime, I thank you all.
It's all about trying to make it.